the museum. This talk is based on a course that she has been teaching at the National Institute of Design for the last 10 years. This discussion is also part of the exhibition Engraved Treasures Part 2 that is concluding on the 30th of April at the Museum of Christian Art. Thank you so much, Arathi, for being with us, and I hand over to you now.
Thank you, Leena. Can we get started? Can everybody hear me? Because I wasn't able to hear everyone too clearly.
We can hear you, Aarti, clear.
All right. Yeah, so this is a talk. We can get to the next slide, Pooja. This is a talk about the Leuven Bible. Can we just go to the next slide? Yeah. Which is a part of the collection of the Museum of Christian Art. This is an 18th century Bible printed in Belgium, and in all likelihood brought to Goa to help the effort at the Konkani translation. This is not a confirmed fact, but we think that's why it came to Goa. If you haven't visited the museum yet, if you can go to the next slide. If you haven't visited the museum yet, there's a beautiful exhibition at the museum that uses the engravings, that is the visual plates, to get artists to respond to it with their own interpretations, which if you haven't gone so far to see, you must definitely put on your calendar. But what this talk will do is it will shine a light on the other aspect of the Bible, which is the text. So here we are going to be talking about the type and the typography and the text. That is, can we look at the text also as a part of the art of the Bible, rather than text that you read and get information from. Next, please. So this would be roughly what I'm talking about, with the beauty of a page like this. The next. So this is a talk about the fact that type is a visual representation of language. Yeah. So next, please. So we read with our conscious mind, but we respond with our subconscious mind. Our responses are based on a deep human instinct. So if you see something that's red and sharp, does it make you alert? If you see something that's symmetrical, does it make you think it's credible? Can we go to the next? If you see something that's soft and yellow, does it make you think it's a friendly message? So these are things that you don't have to go to a design school to learn, or learn formally. This is something that's just encoded in us. So can we go to the next? So I'm going to start off this talk with some basic understanding about writing. So writing is basically something that comes from the material that is used right at the beginning to create it. So if we go back to seeing Sumerian cuneiform, it was actually written on wet clay with a reed. So you see all the forms are reflect the fact that it's wet clay and the fact that it was written on with the reed. So all the forms have been formed by the material that was used to create it. Next. Next slide, please. Closer to home, we are looking at Tamil letter forms and how they have formed over the years. So while Tamil is based on a Dravidian language that's about 3,000 years old, modern Tamil letter forms are based on a language that was created 1400 years ago. So we have a very long time span in which we can see how it's developed over time. Can we go to the next? So the letter forms were written by using a stylus on palm leaves. That's what we had in the previous slide. So it's written with a stylus. Can we go to the next one? You'll see that it was held in a fist. The stylus was held in a fist, and they wrote it like this, you know. So that created, obviously, angular letter forms would tear the leaf, and the round loopy forms will kind of stay on the palm leaf. So that created the looping forms that we see now in the Tamil letters. Next slide, please. But when you see this same letter forms transcribed onto a wall, as it has been in the Brihadishwara temple in the 8th century, you'll see that the same style of writing on a palm leaf is transcribed onto granite, which obviously would not have taken that form very easily. Next, please. And this sort of what it kind of shows, the previous slide shows, is that changes in writing is very incremental. It happens very slowly over a period of time. But what makes a big change is huge cultural disruptions, as colonization did in India. Now, if you see this was a Bible that was made in Taragambadi, where the colonists actually learned the language and created these letter forms, but made it reflect the Latin letter forms that were prevalent in Europe at the time. So you see what I call Latin Tamil over here. Can we go to the next? And this form of writing continues to today. So if you see printed Tamil, it's more likely to look like this, you know, with sharp edges and angular, not in all cases, but in most cases. Next. This is how I learned Tamil, in this very angular form, and it's probably still being taught in this way. So when I write a very angular version of the language. Next. So I'm going to take you through this, through the understanding of type on this Bible through 3 quick stories. The first one is, and these stories range from the 1st century to the 18th century, and will probably throw light on the various aspects of the book. So while I'm not going to be talking about specifically the Bible, I'm going to be talking about stories around it that gives you a better understanding of what the components are. So the first story is called Trajan's Great Victory. Trajan was a Greek emperor. Can you go to the next slide? Who in his, he wanted to extend his eastern borders, and he had 2 great campaigns to capture the eastern borders. And when he did, next slide, he put up this pillar as a monument to showcase his victories. And pillars back then, I imagine, were the ways in which you advertised or you spoke about your great announcements, much like the billboards of today. Next. So he did this by having a frieze that wrapped itself around this pillar, carved to tell the story of his victories. So this was, in fact, it was done so beautifully that, can we go to the next slide? It was done like a comic strip. So it's sometimes very affectionately called the world's first comic strip. And this is a reproduction of that by National Geographic. But our story, next slide, please. Our story here is about the text. So this text actually was at the base of this pillar and talks about the Emperor Trajan. Can we go to the next one? So this text was, we guess, because it dates back to 126 AD, We guess that it was first painted upon and then with a flat brush and then carved. But can we go to the next one? It's a close-up of this. So you'll see that this carving, the chisel actually, if you see the bottom of the T, there's a kind of a foot. And so we think that the chisel was steadied with that foot and then it was carved. And then on the top of the letter form also it was steadied again. So this actually forms a foot at the bottom and a kind of a top which still persists to this day, and it's referred to as a serif. Can we go to the next slide? And this form was so beautiful that it's been drawn and redrawn over time. This is a 1920s redrawing. Can we go to the next? And it's used to the present day in movie posters. Yeah, move to the next one. It was also, so if you notice that the same letter forms were used in coins minted at that time. So this is an understanding that once a letter form is created right at the beginning, based on the material it was created on, and in this case, probably a calligraphic form, it continues to be used on all material. Next. So next story is about the manuscript through the Middle Ages. So the Middle Ages refers to the medieval times, from the end of the Roman Empire to the start of the Renaissance. Can we go to the next? So prior to the Middle Ages, most of the manuscripts were in a scroll format, or if it needed longevity and if it needed to be, written on like a notepad and erased and rewritten, it was written on wax tablets. Next. The material that was used for this was parchment or skin of various animals. So they used the skin of goats, they used the skin of calves, and this parchment, if it was calf skin, it was referred to as vellum. Can we go to the next? And the reason why they used it is because other than the fact that it was animal skin and it could be stretched, it could be smoothened, it was very easy to write on. But unfortunately, to create a book, you needed a whole herd of calves. So it was of animals. So these scrolls over time, because they could not be protected, they got folded and they were put between two bits of wood, which is how book-like manuscripts got created. And in those days, they're referred to as codex. Can we go to the next? So here you see a book that was created with parchment papers, parchment sheets inside, and a binding made of wood. Can we go to the next, please? So paper came very much later. It came around the 11th or 12th century. And by the 13th century, it was of a decent quality that was comparable to vellum. So books started being made of paper as well. Can we go to the next? The writing was done with feathers of large birds like goose, and the tips were cut with a pen knife, which is where we get the term pen knife. And next. And the letter forms that were created used that angle of the nib in a constant slant, and then the letters were written. So you see that there's a thick part to the letter and a thin part to the letter. These books were hand copied by people known as scribes, and these were usually monks or nuns, because literacy only was kind of confined to religious cloisters, and they copied this by hand and then got it illustrated by someone, or they illustrated it themselves. Next. And scriptorium, this is kind of a retelling of what a scriptorium looked like. There were dank places with not much light, and they kind of sat there the whole day and worked. And there are many instances of these scribes talking about very poor working conditions. So very similar to present day kind of production lines. Next. Uh, the audience for these books were the rich and the nobility, because they were the only people who were educated, and because it was for the aristocracy and for royalty, these books were also designed to look like jewels. They used precious metals, they used gold for the illustrations, and because in candlelight they would light up as if from within, they were known as illuminated manuscripts. Next. So this also served in the medieval times. There was a lot of wars and a lot of skirmishes. So especially religious books were very well decorated, so that when people kind of ran away, they chose to take objects like this with them. So a lot of manuscripts exist for the fact that they were made of very sturdy material, and also because they were decorated like this to feel very precious. So part of this story, I'm just going to quickly go through the different parts of a manuscript, which will give us a better understanding of, uh, the Leuven Bible as an art object. So the first part of it is margins. So every page has margins, right? So let's go to the next page. Next slide. So so if you look at a page, you have these margins. So this is what we would broadly call a classical layout. And the classical layout will have different widths of margin. So you see the margin on top is narrow, the margin on the side has some width, the margin at the bottom is really big. It also has two columns of text. We call these text in these lines, I mean in this format, columns, and the space between the columns is referred to as a gutter. So just going back to the margin, if you were writing on a page, you're likely to leave space to have your hand supported, right? So we think that some of the ideas of how big the margin is has to do with the actual functional aspect of writing and making sure your hand stays on the page and doesn't fall off the page. Can we go to the next slide? So over centuries, this has been kind of examined and measured and checked, and one of them is this particular mathematical working of a page, which is based on the golden ratio. So when they finally figured out how this page must have been measured, they figured out that the golden ratio becomes applicable to it. So for those who are not fully aware of the golden ratio, I presume, can we go to the next slide? So it is actually a ratio of it's a proportion that stays constant, and it has been connected to it's known as the divine proportion because it's been connected to all the proportions of the living creatures around us, and also astronomy and at the atomic level. And so so this is a proportion that has created an ideal of aesthetic proportion and has been used by artists and architects for millennia. Can we go to the next slide, please? So margins were also used for decorative purposes, and to put in glossaries and notes in the margin. Can we go to the next slide? You'll see that there are notes in the margin, and it's very fascinating to see how arrows were depicted back in the day in medieval times. The next part is the length of line. Can we move forward, please? So you will see that from the Dead Sea Scrolls, which goes back to 300 BC, to just move, just keep going to the next slide, to a document in the 8th century AD. Next slide, please. To a book in the 15th century, and the next slide. To a document, a book in the present day. The line length has been fairly, similar. That doesn't change. Can you go to the next, please? So you'll find that the line length is based on the length of line that the eye can read without getting tired. And that also conforms to this proportion that can actually be measured. Go to the next slide, please. So for books and documents that have a lot of information that doesn't want the eye to get tired at all, the line length gets a little shorter so that your eyes don't get tired. That is the point. And that continues to the present day. Next slide. So you'll see it in a lot of magazines, in some books, in many magazines. Next, please. So word spaces are actually a very interesting thing because they are just spaces. They're not even text, but they played a very important role in how we read today. Next, please. So originally, in the Roman times, there were dots that were put between words that indicated that one word had ended and the next word had started, and these were called interpuncts. Interpunct. Next slide. But after that, during the Roman times, there was absolutely no space between words. They just went on continuously. Next one. So they read something like this, but the Romans did not read their text. They always, there was a huge status symbol in having somebody else, like a slave, read the text to you. And this carried on into the start of the Middle Ages. Next, please. Where the books and Bibles, obviously, because they were part of the sermon format in a church, were read out to people. So literacy was at about 10 to 15% in Europe at the time. So people were not reading the information. It was always read out to them. So there wasn't much of independent reading at the time. Next, please. So in the meanwhile, what had happened was that because in the Middle Ages, after the Roman Empire, literacy levels had gone down, there were very many different types of scripts in all corners of Europe, and these were mostly in religious cloisters. So there was no standardization. Nobody could read each other's text. It was very local to that population. Next, please. This was until Emperor Charlemagne in 800 AD became emperor, and he decided to bring his empire together by standardizing the text that he was the great he was a great Roman emperor who brought his empire together by converting everybody to Christianity. So he naturally wanted the Bible to be accessible to all parts of his empire because of the fact that he brought his empire together through religion. And so can we go to the next slide? So he used the services of monks to create this standardized letter forms, and educated the people in the kingdom to read one kind of text. This was known as the Carolingian minuscules. And at this point, he brought in, or rather, they brought in spaces between words. This was when the spaces came in. And when the spaces came in, it became possible for people to not just read independently, but also read silently. So it took the word spaces to be able to do that. Can we go to the next slide? So paragraph breaks are similar, except that paragraphs obviously divide ideas. They kind of separate ideas from the other. So can we go to the next slide? So when it was a continuous script, obviously if someone is reading it and then he looks up, he can't find the next idea on the page. So they started off by marking the next idea with a little color or something like that. Next. And soon, to end an idea, they started using the word kaput, and kaput was indicated with a K to begin with, and soon it became C because they used another word for it. Like I said, it was incremental, and so they would mark the C, and that C soon became a sign called pilcrow, which is like a P inverted, and this kind of indicated on that continuous text where a new idea started. Next. So then when they said, oh, okay, let's divide them and put them onto the next line, the pilcrow stayed at the beginning of each paragraph. Next. And this pilcrow soon got replaced by capital letters. That is, the first letter of every paragraph became capitalized and kind of stood out, much like the pilcrow did in the earlier version. And then to start chapters, these capitals got blown up and decorated. Can we go to the next? And then they took a life of their own. They not just got decorated, they became illustrated, they got illuminated, and they became quite a big feature in the page. Can we go to the next? And we continue to see it today. I think the origin of the drop cap, I mean, now it's referred to as a drop cap. The origin of a drop cap has been completely forgotten, and now it's a completely decorative feature just because. So when books started getting printed and the demand for books kind of started becoming quite a lot, uh, there wasn't time to print it and then get it illustrated, get the drop cap illustrated. So a gap was left uh, in the book. Next. And these gaps became the paragraph indents that we see today. So there's a clear progression of how we got to the present day paragraph writing. Next. So the last story is about printing in Europe. Next, please. So printing started 3,000 years ago in Sumeria, cuneiform. They basically, it was printing on wet clay. So anything that was done, in a replicable manner, started many, many millennia ago. Next, please. But actual printing on paper for books was started in China and slowly moved to Japan and Korea. And in the next please. And by the 15th century had reached Europe and Gutenberg, and the first books were printed, kind of mass printed in a sense. So, it started in 3000 BC, but only started becoming this mass printed technology in the 15th century. But there were three, can we go to the next? Please? So there were three instances, three different conditions that created this mass printing. So again, we are looking at this sudden disruption of what was going on for 1,000 years. Manuscripts were being written and they were progressively, slowly moving ahead. And suddenly printing came into the fore. And three major things happened all around the same time that this created a fertile ground for printing to take hold. The first was that uh, Europe was getting urbanized, and people was beginning to get uh, more of a buying power, if we could say that. And they started demanding better education. So universities started opening around the 11th and 12th centuries across Europe. And what started off as being a way to train clergymen opened out to the general public, and people started going to educate, going to get higher education. Next, please. The next condition was that paper had come to Europe. So paper came from China through the Arab conquests of Europe. It came into Europe around the 11th century. To begin with, paper was of a very poor quality, but by the 13th century and the coming of universities, it became evident that paper needed to be of a better quality. So it became smoother, it became more hardy and whiter. So uh, so paper was another, the availability of good paper became another big condition for printing. Next, please. And the third was the trade routes. They opened up the possibilities of Marco Polo, for example, brought back wood block printed books to Europe, which then created a huge movement with wood block printing, and there was a huge demand for this. So, in all, it became a very commercially viable prospect to start printing in Europe. Next, please. So Gutenberg, who was basically a trader, but he was also an engraver. Uh, uh, and he was obviously an innovator because he created this a printing press based on the wine presses, which is quite innovative. And he also carved. He also, along with a team, engraved uh, metal uh, uh, letter forms to create the Bible, which was, I mean, he started off by doing other books, other religious books, but then realized that printing a Bible was going to be a very lucrative, uh, was going to have a very lucrative outcome. Next, please. So this was what Bibles looked like in the early 1400s. So when he printed his Bible, he used similar letter forms. He wasn't going to shake that status quo. Next, please. So when he printed his 42-line Bible, it was done with letter forms that looked exactly like the letter forms that were in use at that time. Can we go to the next one? And this is what it was. It was black letter. This letter form was called textura, this typeface. And like handwritten forms, he did not make one representative letter for each alphabet. He made many, because when you write, you would have different widths of letters to create, a clean block of text. So he kind of created that sort of a feel. Next, please. And these were the letter forms that he created. Next, please. Yeah, this is a close-up. Uh, then came, not long later, a few decades later, came Nicholas Jensen, a French engraver who lived in Italy at the time. And he thought this was not legible at all. this whole thing wasn't legible at all. So he decided to create a more legible version, which was at the time being revived in Italy. Next, please. So this was called, these were the minuscules based on the Carolingian minuscules. Next, please. And when you say humanist, you're talking about handwritten. And he created these letter forms. And these letter forms were created in 1680 and are still used today. I mean, it's the basis of classical typefaces that are still in use today. Next, please. So these letter forms were based on the calligraphic form that we spoke of earlier, the using the calligraphy nib in a certain constant slant. So you can see that it mimics writing. Next. It's used even now, and here are some samples for that. Next. So Garamond came about again a few decades after Jensen, where he was an engraver, but clearly, you can see that these engravers were also kind of jewelers at some level. You can see everything that they did was so decorative and so beautiful that you can actually wear it. So Garamond came and he decided to work on Jensen's letter forms, but he actually, there is more to Garamond, but I'm not going to go there. I'm just going to take one representative letter form. And can we go to the next, please? And this is what he created. The typeface he created was this. So you can see that they are extremely beautiful. You know, the form and the space within the form is beautifully thought through. Next, please. But what he did, as you can see here, so you see Jensen follows the slant at a certain angle. But as time progressed, so Garamond would be old style. The slant starts moving because it doesn't really matter where the slant needs to be anymore, because now we are printing, we're not writing, right? So again, because it needs to be an incremental movement to change, all these things were going very slowly, decade upon decade. You know, the slant would change just a little bit. Next, please. Yeah, next, please. So this is just a few slides to kind of show the beauty of the letter form, because it's the beauty of the form as well as the space. You know, how gently it holds the space, how beautifully the strokes kind of connect. There's no heaviness anywhere. It's just, you know, light, and it flows. You can actually see the movement. So if you stop looking at it as a G and you start looking at it as a form, it's really a work of art. Next, please. So I just combined these two letter forms just to show you how jewel-like they are. You know, if you run short of ideas on something that needs to be jewel-like, just take two letter forms, classical letter forms, and put them together. Next, please. Also, these letter forms are not what you think they are. You know, you may think that because, you know, there's a straight line at the bottom, it's going to be an absolutely straight line. But these are corrected a lot to make visual sense. Uh, you know, this curve in the base, if it's printed and looked at from afar, it will look like a straight line, because when you print, the ink kind of spreads a little bit, and that kind of fills up spaces. So yeah, so there are a lot of these adjustments that are made, which you need to look at a form closely to see. Next, please. These are called ligatures, just stunningly beautiful. This is when two letter forms are next to each other and would, without having a special form, interfere with each other in space. So this is, they're kind of made into a composite form. Next, please. So these are called ornaments, and these are used to highlight, to end text. And they're actually like ornaments, actually designed to be a jewel. Next, please. These are ampersands, my most favorite. Yeah. The next part I need to talk to you about is italics. Italics are based on handwritten text. This is actually a resume written by Leonardo to the Duke of Milan. Uh, so actually quite interesting. So next, please. So italics were originally used. These were kind of condensed letter forms used for cheaper publications, which needed to kind of put as many letters into a page as possible. Next. And the beauty of italics, I mean, these are, I say, these have got shifting spines. Especially classical italics, they kind of move and yet work together. Next, please. So this is an example of a very beautiful italic done at the same time as Garamond. And here I've just pulled out some letter forms that kind of show the beauty of form. I particularly like this 8 because it sits so precariously on one point and yet is completely stable. It just stands there. This lovely ballooning form just stands there, in no hurry to fall over. And it's just connected by one little point at the base. Next, please. Yeah, so you see Garamond to in the present day. Something that was designed in, I think, 1690. It still finds a place in today's world. Next, please. So that brings us to the Bible. So I'm hoping that with this talk, when you look at these pages, they make more sense. They kind of bring to light all the different socio-political, historical. I mean, I'm not an academic, so everything I've told you is a story, and I could be like far wrong. But then the socio-political story and the continuum stays, and you kind of understand that all this isn't just something that somebody wrote. There's a lot behind every single element that goes into the Bible's page. Next, I think I have one more picture or more. Yeah, this is just stunningly beautiful. Thank you. If you'll just give me a moment, I think I'm running out of battery, so I'll just put that in.
In the meantime, if anyone has comments or questions, you could either put it into the chat box or raise a hand and you could ask your question yourself.
Yeah, that's good.
So we have one question here, Arathi, which is coming.
I'm sorry, I can't hear you too well.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah, I can hear you.
So there's one question because we opened it up for questions now. When were the punctuation marks created? Interrogation, exclamation marks, etc. So that's a question that's coming from Sneha.
Actually, that's a very long story. Uh, if you're interested, I could put you onto a book that will actually take you through uh, that. It also happened over time. It's not like at one point that punctuation marks were created. Uh, so I will put that onto the chat for anybody who's interested.
All right. I have a question myself. Uh, is there something comparable to the Trajan column in India or in the Oriental context,
Of course, there's the Ashoka pillar.
which of course is there?
Yeah, which actually predates the Trajan column by several hundred years actually, and is equally beautiful. I mean, the thing is that because the Leuven Bible is placed in Europe, I've used the European trajectory to tell the story. But we have a lot of comparable texts and monuments and uh, art that is in India.
Thanks. So Snehal also continues by saying, what about Roman numbers, Roman numerals?
Um, what about Roman numerals?
In addition to her question about the interrogation and exclamation
I
marks,
think that's part of the language. I mean, the language itself. Here, I'm actually talking about type forms. To understand type forms, um, I am sorry, I won't be able to answer that question in terms of. I presume you're asking what about the forms of the numbers. I think that is part of how the language developed. So I don't have a good answer for that. And how numbers were formulated.
yeah, so she says thanks.
So if anyone doesn't have any other questions, I'll end the session with thanking Aarti for such a wonderful session. I think we all had a lot to learn from it. Thank you, Leena.
I do have one question, Gunjan. I'm sorry to interrupt your closing talk, Aarti. Just to say that I was having a conversation the other day with someone about AI. Now, AI, that is sort of verbal prompts will generate imagery as well as video and other things. So what happens to something like the type, something, I mean, books themselves now? It's a very vast and broad question, but it's coming to mind when we're talking about the very physical aspects of these, this art form. What is the direction of something like type when books themselves and even websites may change vastly because of AI?
It's actually a very interesting thing because when I teach this course, we obviously bring the story up to the present. And the one thing I'm constantly telling everybody is the story, and I think I've also mentioned earlier that the story never changes. Only context and technology does. And that's actually something that I've been trying to even say here, that if my line length, how I read a book isn't going to change. How so like today there are thousands and thousands of typefaces, and their typefaces are no longer earlier. You'd each each size of typeface had to be cut painstakingly, but now you create one typeface and you just generate all sizes. It's like literally you know in a very short time you generate all sizes, you generate all thicknesses, widths. These are called super fonts. So with AI, a lot is going to change, but how we uh, read and how we absorb information will never change.
Okay, yeah, that's a good way to think about it, actually.
Yeah. So it's
Yeah.
never changed, it will never change, which is why I was showing you how the line length on the Dead Sea Scroll is the same as the line length today. Because that's how we read.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Everyone said so. Extremely illuminating and really interesting. Yes. So those are the messages. And thank you once again, Arti. Gunjan, over to you again.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you, Arti. It was a very good session. I've learned so much, and I've always been very interested.
I can't hear you too well.
Is it better now?
Can you hear each other?
I can hear you.
Okay, I can't hear you too well, Gunjan.
All right. Just wanted to thank you for this great session. Thank you, Leena, for making it possible. And thank you for all the participants who came and chose to spend your Friday evening with us, which is really great. So thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you. And those who are here, please join us for the events that will take place on the evening of the 30th from 6:45 p.m. onwards. And we look forward to seeing you again. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you.